Greetings, everybody. Time for part 3 of Houses for the Dead, my short story. That night, Timothy tried to keep his eyes closed, but the harder he tried, the more open they were, and the more awake he was. He tossed and turned on the davenport. The fabric was rough and sturdy, and his grandmother had put a sheet on the cushions, but the edge had peeled up, and his bare leg kept finding the one sheetless spot. His whole body itched. They'd offered him the guest bed, but that was where his parents slept when they visited, and this was where he slept. After a long time, he sat up and looked through the sliding glass door. The man stood with his hat in his hand, and Timothy went through the entire routine: door, food, quiet, exit. This time, the man did not gesture, but Timothy followed. He slipped on his tennis shoes and ran out the front door, barely catching the screen before it smacked shut. The man walked a bit faster. He didn't glance down at Timothy. The sky was partly clouded over, and the moon fired the edges of the clouds. The clouds moved in what seemed to be a pattern, bold zigzags revealing patches of stars. They reached the end of High Street and crossed into Hill Cemetery and down past the Civil War graves and the mausoleums that belonged to families rich enough to want houses for their dead. Timothy was pretty sure he understood dying, enough at least so that he wasn't frightened, not of the burying part at least. At church, he listened to the preacher talk about a recently deceased member of his grandmother's parish. Timothy's grandparents sat close, pressing against his sides so that he could feel their comforting bodies holding him when he took deep breaths. The preacher said he wanted to talk to the children in attendance, and said that the best part of the deceased, all that was worth anything, all that God created and loved, all that wasn't made from dust and returned to dust, was off and gone to a better place. How come it's so secret? His grandmother held his hand and stared at him with her watery eyes, and then the organ started, and everyone stood up and began singing "Spirit of Faith, Come Down," and he stood and leaned against the pew and thought of his brother, who he could barely remember, and who was now in a better place that no one would tell him about. "Hey," he said to the man as they walked down past more graves, but the man did not stop. Timothy stopped next to the grave with 4 names on it. "Hey, stop," he said. The man kept moving, his hat bobbing farther and farther down the hill. "I gave you dinner," Timothy shouted. Soon he was all by himself, and the wind was stronger, and some animal with pink eyes was looking at him from between 2 old stones slanted from years of wind, the ground nearly black all around, the clouds thicker and lower. A low chittering began, like rows of chains moving across a floor, or groups of tiny people giggling in the dark, or thousands of pennies dropping on a floor far away. He should have felt scared. It wasn't the first time he'd been alone. Once, after Benjamin left and his parents spent weeks in bed, Timothy had climbed into the garage and slept in the old car. He'd waited and waited for someone to come find him, but when they didn't, he'd kicked in all the glass in the dashboard and went inside to eat cereal. He could always go back to his grandparents' house and eat. But on the next night, he'd certainly lock the door and make faces at the hungry man. He walked down one of the rows of graves and found Elwyn Robson, his great-grandfather, who was in a better place. He sat down and waited. In a little while, the man returned and stood in front of him. He was even thinner and dirtier than usual, like he was still hungry and had been fighting for food. "You left me," Timothy said. The man removed his hat and held it over his heart. He bowed his head. "Whatever," Timothy said. "I don't want to hear it. I've heard quite enough. Is that what you learned in your home? You should thank me for all I've done for you." The man nodded, his eyes bright like they might burst into flames, like inside his head he kept a secret star. "Where are you off to, anyways?" Timothy said. The man held out his hand. "You gotta walk slower, okay?" You gotta pay attention. I wanted to ask you a question. The man tilted his head. What do you know about the better place? The man smiled. His teeth waggled loose in his gums. He kneeled down on the path and placed his hands on the grass. He patted the grass, rubbed it with his fingers. Timothy stared at his hands. That doesn't help me at all, he said. You should just go back to being quiet. They both stood, and the man started walking again, slower, but with no less purpose. Timothy reached for and took the man's hand, which was light and brittle as dried corn husk. Together they walked down into Rosemont until they hit Main, a long street lined with old stores, square and squat, with big picture windows with the names of the owners on them. All of the stores were closed and the street lights buzzed. At the far end of the street, one building had lights. The man took Timothy toward the building. It was a newsstand with a soda fountain. Inside, there were older kids sitting at the booths, drinking pop. The boys wore slacks and button-up shirts and black loafers. The girls wore jeans with the cuffs rolled up and blouses with the top button undone. One of the girls wore a kerchief around her neck. Behind the counter, a young couple made floats and sold candy. The sign out front said, Pearson's Newsstand, candy, sodas, floats, sundaes. And Timothy remembered hearing about this place where his mother used to work for her parents when she was a teenager. She stood behind the counters and sold lifesavers and pop and went out to the corner at 3 p.m. every day to get the evening edition of the Rosemont Standard and fill the machine with one bundle and stock the counter with another. His grandfather would bring the Oldsmobile out front and they deliver the remaining bundles to individual houses while his grandmother minded the store. He looked to the man, who was more and more hollow, like he was being eaten from the inside, and more dirty, like he was walking through loam instead of air. He smelled like turned compost, like roots just pulled from the garden. I didn't know this place was even open anymore, Timothy said. I thought they closed it down before I was born. The man pointed inside. Near the back door, the girl in the kerchief leaned against the wall beneath an A&W sign. She held a book in one hand and was speaking into an old black telephone receiver attached to a phone the size of a cinder block hanging on a wall. When the man behind the counter came over to her, she placed the receiver against her shoulder and they spoke. The man looked like Timothy's grandfather. The girl leaned up and kissed his cheek, and he kissed the top of her head. It was exactly how he and his own mother had said goodbye a week ago. The memory of the pressure of her lips against his hair warmed him for a moment. And then for the first time that night he grew afraid. The worry started slowly, a blue pilot light flickering in the basin of his memories, and grew into an expansive wave. His mother was never coming for him. The best part of her now was with Benjamin, stored in a secret location, and he'd be forced to search for them forever with this man as his guide. Do you know where my mother is? Timothy asked, but the man was already moving away from the newsstand, holding his hand out. By the time Timothy looked back toward the store, the lights had been shut off and the people turned out into the street. A few figures danced down Main, boys chasing girls. One couple walked slower, the girl's head on the boy's shoulder. The girl who'd been on the phone came out the door and locked it behind her. Her kerchief fluttered in the breeze, her hair streaming across her face. She held Timothy's gaze for a moment and then was off to follow her friends. The man paused, but he did not turn around. Timothy tried to relax and take his hand, but each attempt failed. His hand passed through air. They walked to the end of Main and took a left onto Stone Avenue and walked over the humpback bridge down by Grogan's garage with its gas pumps and service bell and glowing, spinning Phillips 66 sign. The parking lot was puddled with oily water. They turned on Mason and went up a long driveway that Timothy recognized as belonging to the Pearson family, one of his grandmother's brothers. They had visited the house several years earlier, all of them, and it had been empty and scary. It sat at the top of a large hill on the opposite side of Rosemont from High Street. Both hills loomed over downtown like sentries. The house had been in such disrepair that his father had declared it a damn shame and a waste of good house bones. He'd said that if he had the money to pay the back taxes, he'd buy the place for himself and renovate it and have himself $1 million view. He'd picked up Benjamin to his shoulders and asked him how he'd like to sled down a hill like this one, and Benjamin whooped with joy, though there was no snow, and they never returned. Someone must have bought the $1 million view since then, because the house was bright and clean, each window open, the breeze catching the curtains and billowing them into the rooms. The man walked right up the front steps and opened the door. "How come you don't eat here?" Timothy said. The man waved him inside. The foyer was warm and comfortable. Several candles were set out, and a large book with a fancy pen lay on a stand. On a coat rack, several coats and hats hung. The man put his hand onto Timothy's back and guided him into the next room, which was full of couches and chairs, small tables, and wobbly, expensive lamps. At the far end of the room, the man slid aside 2 large doors that disappeared into the wall. Opposite the doors lay another room, this one full of people with their heads down, some of whom were crying. At the front of the room, a small coffin sat on a stand. Timothy and the man walked past the mourners, each of whom had a blanched face, as if they'd stood too close to a bright light for too long. Each step across the room grew more difficult, and the carpet deeper, until Timothy sank up to his ankles and then his knees. Soon the carpet, with its swirls of reds and blacks, began to spin. The man stood beside Timothy, looking into the coffin. "Help me," Timothy said. "I can't stop." The man turned his cavernous face toward Timothy, his mouth a circle through which warm, wet air flowed. "Please," Timothy said. The man reached out a hand, and although he was lighter than straw, as soon as Timothy touched him, he stopped spinning and found himself on solid floor. The man leaned down and scooped Timothy from the floor and held him in front of his chest. In his arms, Timothy felt immediately tired. "It's a boy, isn't it?" Timothy said. "A boy in the coffin?" The man nodded. They both looked down into the coffin. He was a tall, older boy, skinny and sharp, with a crooked jaw and close-cut hair. He was older than Timothy expected, almost a man. He looked familiar, but far away. Soon, they made way for the others, a constant stream of weeping women and red-faced men who smelled of English leather. By the door, Timothy saw the girl with the kerchief crying uncontrollably, her shoulders heaving beneath her blouse. Thanks a lot. Part 4 tomorrow.